government has gone on a decade-long spending spree with absolutely no concern for what's going to happen in the long run. The government's record speaks for itself. We've seen the largest tax hike in Ontario history, and it still hasn't been enough to keep up with this government spending. They're addicted to spending on special interest groups, appeasing unions and government employees, using corporate welfare to bribe companies to create jobs, using subsidies to hide their failed policies, and continuing to give runaway compensation and salaries to government employees. We've seen endless scandals under this government, from the gas plant cancellation to Orange and e-health, the Pan Am Games expenses, and the Green Energy Act. Enough is enough. This has all happened under borrowing and using debt. The debt has doubled in Ontario over the last decade with this government. And thanks to that debt, Ontario taxpayers send $10 billion each year to cover interest on the debt. It's the third largest expense in government. The CTF has been giving recommendations and giving warnings to this government, and they failed to listen. We cannot sit idly by and let them continue to destroy the finances of our province. And that's why the CTF is launching this campaign. We are ringing the alarm bells in Ontario that this debt is going to bankrupt our province. Ontario is playing a dangerous game. We're on an uncertain path, and we're heading towards where Greece is. Ontario's debt to GDP ratio is exactly what Greece's was a decade ago. And future generations are going to suffer, and they're going to bear the brunt for paying off Charles Sousa's and Premier Wynne's debt. Premier Wynne and Charles Sousa have a choice. They can continue to shirk responsibility, to continue to run more deficits, to borrow and to contribute to the debt, or they can take responsibility. They can listen, and they can change course. People like the little guy in our ad, they don't have a choice. They're going to inherit Charles Sousa's debt no matter what. It's just a matter of how much debt they're going to inherit. Today's ad is just the beginning. CTF is launching Bankrupting Ontario, trying to raise awareness, get people to our website, get people aware and talking about the issue of debt in Ontario. We're trying to raise more money so we can put more ads up. First, we're going to put ads across Mississauga, then we're going to go across the province. Ontario's debt may have been worsened by Premier Wynne, but it's been the responsibility of all parties. It's not a partisan issue. Everybody's responsible for contributing to this debt, and it should be the top priority of all parties to get us out of this debt. Today, we are putting Charles Sousa on notice. Do something about this debt. If the budget coming out on May 1st is another budget running a deficit, using borrowing to finance more spending, not addressing the debt, and kicking the can further down the road, Charles Sousa, we are going to make it our goal and our priority to make sure every constituent in this riding in Mississauga South knows about your record, knows about your debt, and knows that any election that comes up, it will be top of mind. Balancing the budget should be your first priority. Thank you very much. And since I've been talking, Ontario's debt has gone up by over $100,000. I'm happy to take any questions.
So Candice, do you think that the entire focus should be on getting rid of the debt and the deficit and no new spending in a budget whatsoever?
I think even more than that, not just no new spending. The government needs to take steps to reduce spending. They've been running deficit year after year, spending more than they're bringing in through revenues. It's not sustainable. Our debt is almost $300 billion. So they have to do something, not only to get to a balanced budget, but then to commit to somehow paying off this debt.
We heard a new spending promise today for the 2014 budget to give a raise to early childhood educators, something they've been calling for, something they feel is needed to bring them sort of more up to par with other education professionals in the province. What do you make of that?
I just think it's another sign that government doesn't get it. You know, they're out there making new promises, promising to spend more money. Really what they're doing is burying their head in the sand, not addressing this debt. They're not realizing the severity of the situation, just how bad carrying this much debt is. You know, they're shrugging their shoulders and saying we need to continue to give everybody raises, to make these big promises. Meanwhile, not really thinking about who's going to pay, who's going to pay the price, who's responsible for paying for all their big promises. Well, the CTF is ringing the alarm bell. We're saying it's taxpayers who are going to be responsible. It's future taxpayers. It's our children and our grandchildren. That's entirely irresponsible, and that's what we're trying to. That's the message we're trying to convey today.
We've heard about a series of spending promises leading up to the budget, which will come on May 1st. What do you think the Liberal government is trying to do right now?
Well, they're not taking responsibility. I think that they are doing their plan that they always do, which is making big promises, spending other people's money, and trying to bribe special interest groups in order to keep their coalition, in order to get the budget passed, or to avoid an election. And if they do go to an election, you know, they're willing to spend other people's money to get votes. And I think that's basically all we're seeing with all these new targeted spending announcements.
But if we do end up in an election campaign, you must anticipate hearing spending announcements from all three parties.
Yeah, absolutely, and you know that's what they need to do. That's what they do to try to win votes and to get elected. But you know the CTF is here to make people know what the price tag is, what the costs of all those big promises. We'll be tracking all of the spending, all of the promises throughout an election if it does come, so that people are aware of how much it's going to cost for the government to fulfill all their big promises.
But so this isn't just a Liberal government issue. This is any party that's trying to campaign to win issue.
Right. We're in Mississauga this morning to try to send a message to Charles Sousa. But like I said, everybody contributed to the debt. It's all parties. It's a nonpartisan issue. People across the spectrum are going to be responsible for paying back this debt. It affects everyone. And really, it should be the top priority of all three parties to do something about spending, to get the budget or get the budget balance in their financial books back in order, because otherwise, we might be facing a crisis down the road. We might be facing similar to what happened with the Eurozone debt crises, where we simply just can't afford to pay our bills. We don't want to get there. We're trying to avoid that outcome. But if the government just keeps kicking the can down the road, eventually that's where we'll be.
The entire budget is not going to seem to balance in the 2014, 15, 16, or maybe until 17, 18. So meanwhile, we still have the debt, and maybe going to increase more.
And even that, the government's plan is to just balance the budget, the annual budget by 2018. That's not even addressing the debt. The debt still exists. They're still piling up on it. This government doesn't have a plan. They haven't demonstrated any ability or any will to get the province out of the problem that we're in. And that's really why this campaign is necessary. The CTF has made recommendations over and over again to the government to balance the budget. They're not listening. Now we're going to the public. Now we're going to the constituents, to the people of Ontario, telling them to join our cause, to join our campaign, and help us send the government a message.
So the transit is top of the agenda. What's your view on how to develop the transit? Because that's a huge problem right now.
Right, it's a huge problem because of years and years of neglect from the government. The government raises far more through taxes on drivers, through gas taxes, through registrations, through all these fees, and they're not reinvesting it. They haven't reinvested it into roads, so now they're in this big problem with congestion in Ontario, and they're turning back to taxpayers and asking them to bail them out. Well, it's the government's carelessness over years that have gotten us into this problem, and now they want to use even more debt to finance a new program. The CTF showed how the government, using a Gas Tax Accountability Act, could tie gas taxes to infrastructure, to roadway spending, and they would have more than enough to do it that way. So that continues to be what we call for.
So you don't believe Premier Ring said won't raise any taxes to fund the transit?
Well, she said no new taxes, but then she also said she was willing to use bonds, green bonds, to pay. Well, green bonds are just debt, and debt today are taxes tomorrow. So whether it's new taxes now or kicking the can down and forcing future people to pay for the taxes, eventually, it's going to have to be paid for. So what her plan is essentially just boils down to more taxes.
Do you have any suggestion, recommendation about develop the transit?
Yeah, we call for a Gas Tax Accountability Act, which is what they have in Manitoba. It would be a transparent fund to tie all taxes from gasoline, HST on gas, diesel taxes, and other fees, registration, driver registration. So all taxes from drivers would go into one fund, and that fund would be reserved and earmarked just for roadway and infrastructure spending. Right now, the government raises a little over $6 billion on all those taxes, and they only spend $2.7 billion on roadway infrastructure. So there's about $3.4 billion a gap of missing funds, and when we call for them to use those, allocate those towards drivers, towards improving the roadways, transportation, all the infrastructure, so that people in Toronto and across cities in Ontario aren't stuck in congestion, so that they can get to work and get to the places they need to be. But the government doesn't do that. They just spend what they want, and they haven't kept up with the infrastructure needs in Toronto.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.